I thought being a doctor meant treating strangers, not ghosts from my past. But when my estranged father, Gregory Brooks, walked into my exam room as a patient, everything cracked open. Hearing his voice after 30 years hit me like a punch. I excused myself and sobbed in the bathroom. Now, he's alone in hospice, facing the life he chose over me, and I'm his doctor. When I was 7, I waited hours in the coffee shop, holding a comic book he said he'd sign. Gregory never showed. I remember the waitress glancing over with pity every time the door opened. My mom said, "Don't expect too much from him." That night, I cried into my pillow, swearing I'd never give him another chance. But part of me still stared at that empty seat every time I walked by. At 16, I found a photo in Mom's drawer, Gregory smiling with a woman and 2 kids. A new family. My stomach twisted. I confronted her, and she just said, "He moved on." I hated how calm she sounded. I spent nights Googling him, each photo adding fire to the resentment. I wasn't forgotten, I was replaced. That truth became a scar I carried into med school. Into marriage. Into every quiet moment that reminded me I wasn't enough. Each morning after Gregory's admission, I lingered outside his door. I couldn't step in. Instead, I read his vitals and left instructions for nurses. Charlotte urged me to talk to him. But I froze. Seeing his name on the chart made my throat tighten. I told myself I was being professional, but I knew better. Avoidance wasn't medicine. It was fear of him, of the words I'd buried too deep to say aloud. Gregory asked the nurse if I was avoiding him. When she told me, I snapped at her without meaning to. That night, I slammed a cabinet shut, startling Charlotte. "He wants a relationship now," I shouted. Where was he when I needed one? I could see her pain too. She had lost her father young. "Maybe he's trying," she whispered. Her words echoed in the silence that followed. I didn't have an answer, just years of silence. A colleague invited me to a father-son charity run. I declined instantly, stomach tightening. I hadn't run with a father, or played catch, or heard a proud "that's my son." At the event, I watched a boy hug his dad at the finish line. I ducked away, heart pounding. That night, I stood outside Gregory's room again. My hand hovered over the handle, but the weight of 30 years made it too heavy to push open. Charlotte left a letter on my desk. "Maybe you're the only one who can decide what healing looks like," she wrote. It wasn't about Gregory anymore, it was about me. Could I forgive? Not for him, for myself. I walked to the staff room, looked in the mirror, and asked aloud, what would I need to hear? My voice trembled, but I knew something real, not excuses, something that matched the ache I had carried alone. The next morning, I stepped into Gregory's room. He looked older than I remembered, frailer, smaller. He smiled weakly. "You look just like your mom." I didn't reply, just stared. I checked his chart, pretending it was any other patient. But my hands shook. "Why are you here now?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away, just sighed. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was screaming everything we'd never said. I returned the next day, closing the door behind me. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said. Gregory looked startled, then nodded slowly. "I left because I was broken. Addicted. I thought I'd ruin you too." I clenched my fists. "You did anyways." My voice cracked. He looked away, ashamed. "I wanted to be better first." I shook my head. "You had years. This wasn't healing, it was rupture. And it had just begun." Gregory's voice cracked. "I watched your school plays from the back, your graduation too. I was there, just hiding." I felt my stomach drop. "Why not speak to me?" He wiped his eyes. "I thought you hated me." I did, maybe I still did. But part of me wanted to believe him. I slammed my hand on the chair. "That's not parenting, that's cowardice." The pain in his eyes didn't change what I had lost. Nothing could. Later that evening, Charlotte found me alone in the hospital chapel. I was hunched over, hands clasped so tightly they turned white. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered. She knelt beside me. "You don't have to forgive, just decide what matters now." I buried my face in my palms. I wanted him to fight for me. She placed her hand on my back. "Then maybe it's your turn to fight for peace." I brought Gregory his favorite food the next day, chicken and dumplings. He smiled genuinely this time. "You remembered." I nodded. "I remember everything." He took a bite, then winced. "Kidney failure dulls appetite." We talked mostly small things. For once, it wasn't about blame. But when he said, "I wish I'd done better," I stood. Wishing isn't enough. He looked like he might cry. I walked out, unsure if it was a step forward or just retreat. The next morning, Gregory was unresponsive. I rushed in, checking vitals, issuing orders. But something inside cracked. I wasn't his doctor then. I was his son. "Not yet," I whispered, gripping his hand. "We're not done." Nurses moved around me, but all I saw was that man who missed birthdays, games, and my wedding. I fought for him, because I didn't know if I'd regret not trying. In that moment, I realized anger wouldn't bring back lost years. Gregory stabilized. But later that day, he asked for a priest. "There's something I need to confess," he said. I expected guilt, shame. Instead, he told me he had another son, my half-brother, who overdosed 2 years ago. "I failed him worse than I failed you." My jaw locked. "You never told me." He looked away. I didn't know how. That grief, the one he carried silently, suddenly made sense. Maybe I wasn't the only one he couldn't face. I told Charlotte about the half-brother. She froze, then said, "So you weren't the only one left behind." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd spent years thinking I was uniquely abandoned. But Gregory's demons didn't discriminate. That night, I watched him sleep, saw the twitch of nightmares across his face. Maybe it wasn't just shame that kept him away, it was fear that love would collapse under the weight of what he's become. Cleaning out an old drawer in Gregory's bag, I found a photo of me age 10. School picture, creased but well kept. On the back he'd written, "My boy always proud." My chest tightened. I had imagined indifference. maybe hatred, but not this quiet reverence. I sat down, holding it, tears falling before I knew they started. Maybe Gregory hadn't been present, but he had carried me, even if from a distance. It didn't erase everything, but it shifted something. Gregory asked me to sit with him one evening. I know I'm dying, he said, but if you let me, I want to hear about your life. I hesitated. Then I told him about med school, about Charlotte, about nights I wanted to quit. He listened, really listened. When I mentioned our wedding, he smiled. I wish I was there, for the first time. I didn't lash out. Me too, I said, and I meant it. One night, Gregory asked me, do you think your mother ever forgave me? I didn't know. Mom had died 2 years ago. Never speaking of him after the divorce, she stopped hurting. I finally said, that's a kind of forgiveness. He nodded, eyes glassy. Then maybe I can too. He wasn't asking for mine, he was searching for his own. I saw a man ready to die, not with peace, but maybe with less torment. Charlotte brought our son, Eli, to the hospital. Gregory lit up. He's got your eyes, he whispered. Eli stared curious. I watched them, heart torn. Was I giving Eli something I never had, or risking the same wound? Gregory reached for Eli's hand. Hey buddy, and for a moment, time bent. 3 generations touched by loss, maybe healing. I didn't stop it. Maybe part of forgiveness is allowing new moments to grow in the cracks left behind. Gregory gave me a letter sealed in an envelope after he said, that night, curiosity tore at me, but I waited. Days later after he passed, I opened it. Inside was a will. He'd left everything to Eli. I failed you, he wrote, but maybe I can help your son. My hands trembled. It wasn't about money, it was legacy, a final act to say, I see what you became, and it mattered. Charlotte found me on the porch that evening, the letter still in my hands. He tried, I murmured. She sat beside me. You did too. We watched Eli chase fireflies. Do you think he'll ask about Gregory one day? I asked. Charlotte smiled. And you'll tell him, not the pain but the truth. I realized then, healing wasn't a raw sewer, it was choosing what to pass on. And I would pass on courage, not silence. Weeks later, I received a package from Gregory's old lawyer. Inside was a cassette tape and a note for Nathaniel. I found an old player in the hospital storage. Gregory's voice crackled through, telling stories from his youth. His regrets and hopes for me. If I never get to say it in person, know this: I always loved you, even when I didn't know how to show it. I sat there, tape running out, heartbreaking and healing at once. I brought the tape home and played it again, this time with Eli beside me. He didn't understand the words, but he looked at me with curious eyes. That's Grandpa, I said. Eli smiled. In that moment, I realized I was shaping the story Gregory never finished, not just for me but for my son. I paused the tape, looked at Eli, and whispered. He was broken, but he tried, and maybe that's all Eli needed to know. Back at the hospital, a nurse stopped me. Your father made an impression, she said. He talked about you every day. My chest tightened. He hadn't been the ghost I thought. He's been trying to exist quietly, near the edges of my life. I visited the chapel again and lit a candle, not for closure, but for presence. Gregory would never hear me say it, but the words escaped anyway. I missed you, even when I hated you. Cleaning out Gregory's apartment, I found a drawer filled with journals. Every entry mentioned me, birthday thoughts, med school milestones he somehow followed, even small victories I'd long forgotten. Saw Nathaniel's paper published. He's brilliant. I read each line with disbelief. He hadn't been absent, just hidden. His guilt had turned him into a quiet witness. I sat on the floor, surrounded by pages of a man trying to make peace, and for the first time I listened. In one journal, Gregory had written about a dream walking Eli to school, being called Grandpa. He knew it wouldn't happen, but if Nathaniel ever lets me close, I'll be the man I never was. I closed the book, tears blurring my sight. He had dreamed of redemption, not for himself but for me, for Eli. Even if it never came true, it mattered. That dream showed he saw the damage, and wished, deeply, to undo it. A week later, I received a letter from Gregory's sponsor. He talked about you constantly, it read. He said his biggest regret wasn't the addiction, it was missing you grow up. I folded the paper slowly, letting the words sink in. Gregory had fought his demons in silence. And while I didn't witness his struggle, I now saw his intention. Redemption isn't loud. Sometimes it's a whisper in someone else's letter. Years after the damage is done, I stood by Gregory's grave with Eli. The headstone was simple: Gregory Brooks' father. Dreamer redeemed. I'd chosen that last word, not because he reached perfection, but because he tried. Eli placed a toy car beside the stone. For Grandpa, he said. I nodded, blinking away tears. He would have liked that. We walked away, but I felt something settle inside me. Not closure, continuity. Gregory's story didn't end here. It threaded through us, flawed, unfinished, but alive. I framed one of Gregory's journal pages and hung it above my desk. It read, today choose to believe I'm still a father, even if I failed. Patients often ask about it. I say it's a reminder, not of pain but perseverance. The story behind it isn't perfect, it's layered, painful and unfinished, but it's mine, and Gregory's, a legacy stitched from mistakes and mended with effort, one I now carry not with anger, but with honor. Charlotte asked one evening, do you think Gregory ever forgave himself? I paused. I don't know, I said, but I think he wanted to. That night, I dreamt of him sitting beside Eli, pointing out stars, no words, just presence. I woke with tears on my pillow. Maybe dreams aren't just echoes of the past but whispers of what could have been. And if Gregory never reached full peace, maybe I could honor him by seeking it myself. I sat in the exam room where I first saw him walk in. It was empty now, but not silent. The memory was loud, his voice, my gasp, the chaos of 30 years in one moment. I placed a stethoscope on the chair he sat in, a quiet tribute, not to the patient, but to the father who dared to return, who let me see his wounds, and who, in his final days, helped me begin to heal mine. In the months after Gregory's passing, I felt a strange quiet settle in me. Not peace exactly, but less rage. I revisited the journal pages, underlined parts that spoke to me. Love isn't perfect, but it returns if you let it. That line stayed with me. Charlotte and I talked more about what we wanted for Eli, what kind of father I wanted to be. Gregory taught me in absence and in effort what presence really means. I vowed not to vanish, not in distance, not in silence. I gave a talk at the hospital's grief group, sharing Gregory's story, not as a redemption arc but a real one. Sometimes I said, healing comes too late to save the bond, but not too late to soften the pain. A woman in the back cried. Afterward, she told me she hadn't spoken to her dad in 10 years. I handed her one of Gregory's phrases. Trying is still a form of love. We don't choose how people return, but we can choose what to do when they do. Charlotte and I started hosting Sunday dinners for our neighbors, something my childhood never had. We set one extra plate at the table, never filled, but always present, for those we lost too soon, I'd say. Eli began asking more about Gregory. We answered honestly, with warmth. He hurt us, but he tried to fix it, I'd explain. Through those dinners, I found a way to break cycles. Gregory's memory didn't have to be a wound. It could be a lesson, and a legacy. 1 year later, on the anniversary of his passing, we planted a tree in our yard. Eli helped dig. Charlotte tied a ribbon to the sapling. It'll grow, she said, like we did. I stood back, watching the roots take hold. Gregory's absence once shaped me like a scar. Now, his effort shaped me like soil, messy, broken, but fertile. This was an erasure. This was transformation. From silence to story, from pain to presence, and from fatherless to fatherhood.